Hey class, this is Brett Carter, and I'll be discussing the best practices for operating systems, firewalls, and security enhanced Linux, and how to harden each. Alright, best practices for operating systems. First, determine upfront how quickly server updates will be deployed. If a client demands that your IT consultancy download and install operating system performance patches and updates immediately upon release, you should educate them that new patches and updates frequently introduce other issues. 2. Agree how OS patches will be tested. If a client requests that your consultancy test operating system updates prior to installation, you need to ensure that both parties agree about what constitutes testing. And 3. Specify when server reboots will occur. Operating systems frequently require rebooting after the installation of performance patches, security updates, and other OS hotfixes. You need to make sure the client understands that a specific day and time are fair game for regular rebooting the server. How to harden operating systems. There are 6 important steps that you need to know in order to harden an operating system. First, remove unnecessary programs. It helps to remove unnecessary programs because it limits the number of ways a hacker could get into that certain program. Second, use of service packs. You really need to just make sure it's kept up to date. That will ensure, not really ensure protection, but it'll help ensure protection, especially from zero-day attacks. But this is an easy one to do and feel like some measure of advanced security is in place. Third, patches and patch management. Planning, testing, implementing, and auditing patches should be part of a regular security regimen. You need to make sure the operating system is patched regularly as well as the individual programs on the computer. Fourth step is group policies. Define what groups can or can't access and maintain these rules. Sometimes it's simply user error that results in an open door for a cyber criminal. So you need to make sure you have user policies in place and that all of your users are aware and complying of these procedures. Fifth, security templates. Groups of policies that can be loaded in one procedure. These are commonly used in corporate environments. And the sixth step is configuration baselines. Creating a baseline consists of selecting something to measure and measuring it consistently for a period of time. So establishing baselines and measuring them on a schedule that is acceptable to both your standards and maintaining security and your customers' needs will help harden your system. Best practices for firewalls. Keep the enterprise security policy manager or compliance manager in the loop on firewall changes. In most mid-size or large enterprises, there's a security manager, risk manager, or compliance manager role. This person is usually not a hands-on operational worker, so he or she might not have the insight into what the firewall administrators are actually doing to deploy the rules. Clean up unused rules. It's not uncommon for a firewall to have hundreds or even thousands of rules, many of which are outdated and no longer serve the purpose for a business requirement. Unused rules sometimes harbor the potential for malicious attacks. Eliminate conflicting rules. Many firewalls already have such a complex rule base that oftentimes an administrator doesn't know if he or she is implementing a new rule that conflicts with an existing one. This situation can cause a new rule to be completely dysfunctional because of the device. Follow a consistent workflow for requesting and implementing firewall changes. Firewall rules often are not properly documented. Without good documentation, it can be hard to tell who requested a rule or who owns it from a business perspective. This makes it more difficult to comply with regulations such as PSI DSS because it is more difficult to prove that the rule is needed. If there is traffic over that connection, it can be a challenge to know who owns it and for what purpose. And finally, get application developers or the development operations team on the same page with the firewall administrator. It's often the people who are developing new applications or provisioning new services who request changes to existing firewalls. Like any technical role, these folks speak their own brand that isn't well understood by firewall administrators and vice versa. In other words, it may take a few iterations to get a new firewall rule just right because the two sides aren't understanding each other precision. How to harden firewalls. Alright, first, network documentation. All network-related documentation must be updated and currency of content maintained. Network-related documentation should be appropriately identified with date, version number, and commentary as to what changes have been made to the content. Second, change control. Management should document a formal change control policy for amending the firewall's configuration. This policy should describe the principles and objectives on which control process should operate. Having defined when changes should be performed, the objectives should describe change requirements. Third, firewall documentation. Firewall documentation should exist, and as a minimum detail the firewall policy and the rationale for inclusion of each individual rule. Documentations should also justify the exclusion of specific rules where the absence impacts on security of the firewall and/or the corporate network. Fourth, physical security. Ensure that the firewall and the network cabling related to it are physically secured. Physical access to the firewall or the related network cabling provides opportunities for an intruder to bypass the firewall itself. Fifth, patches. Ensure that the patches to the base operating system and to the firewall are current. For a firewall to be successful, it must operate on a secure operating system. If the firewall is running on an inferior system, then it is open to attacks not possible according to the firewall. Sixth, backup procedures. Ensure that backup procedures exist for the firewall configuration and the log files. The firewall should be backed up to ensure quick recovery from data loss. And finally, alert procedure. If alerts are enabled, then there should exist a documented procedure for handling the alert. Best practices for security enhanced Linux. Enable firewall. Some Linux distributors do not enable the local firewall by default. This can pose a significant security risk if the server is directly connected to the public internet. It is suggested that the local Linux firewall IP tables are always enabled. Restrict root SSH access. It is recommended that remote access over SSH be disabled. This prevents a brute force attack from compromising the root user and encourages users to log into the server with their own individual user accounts. User accountability can be invaluable. SSH key authentication. Most users rely on username and password credentials to establish authentication when connecting to a host. A strict password policy can help ensure relatively strong passwords are used, but SSH keys can be used to improve security further. Enable SELinux. Most modern Linux distributors have security enhanced Linux enabled by default. This can be confirmed with the following command: SE status. Service management can be more complicated with SELinux enabled. However, SELinux should not be disabled due to an inconvenience. There are many online resources explaining how to manage services with SELinux while SELinux is enabled. Apply software updates. It is always important to keep your software updated. This reduces the likelihood that a program or service will be exploited due to an unforeseen bug. Disable unnecessary services. Any services not being actively used should be disabled. It is even better to entirely remove or uninstall the software when possible. When installing a new distribution of Linux, it is usually a good idea to start with a minimal install option and add only the software packages needed. Create users for people and services. A user should never log into a server directly as the root user. Each user logging into the server should be required to use their own individual user account. This will help prevent a user or application from unintentionally performing a dangerous task that can infect the entire system. Process isolation. Isolating processes can reduce the likelihood of a compromised process affecting the entire environment. Process isolation can be achieved by spreading services across several physical servers, virtual machines, or within a single environment using true or Linux containers. Encrypt network traffic. Any sensitive data sent over the public internet should be encrypted. SSH is the most common method of remotely managing Linux, a server, but a VPN can be used to further secure an environment. Finally, monitor server logs. Log files are crucial when it comes to security. Not only are they useful when troubleshooting service issues, they are also necessary to identify if a system is being attacked or when and how a system had been compromised. How to harden security enhanced Linux. Plan the server installation. The first step is hardening a Linux server is determining the server's function, which determines the services that need to be installed on it. Tighten the secure shell protocol. SSH gives the user a connection to a remote computer. Systems administrators commonly use SSH to log into their servers from a remote computer to do maintenance and administrative tasks. One of the most common methods for hardening SSH is to change the port number used to access it. Write firewall rules. You can deny access to your server through your firewall. Ubuntu server uses a firewall called Uncomplicated Firewall, or UFW for short, which is a management tool for IP tables. IP tables filters network packets based on the rules systems administrators writes. IP tables can be complicated for beginners, but UFW simplifies it. Using UFW can help harden your server, but if you write rules for IP tables, you can fine-tune a server's security. Monitoring your system. After you take steps to prevent intrusion, you need to set up a monitoring system to detect whether an attack against your server has taken place. If you're alerted to an attack, you're better prepared to handle it. Tripwire alerts you to unauthorized activity that takes place with system files on your server. Use LogWatch to create reports you can analyze. Users and groups. On a Linux system, you can organize users into groups for easy administration, but you also need to provide access to files and folders through permissions. Encryption. Encryption is a process of scrambling data stored on a computer in a manner that makes it unreadable to anyone who doesn't possess the key to recreate the data in its original form. Data that has been encrypted can be stored on a local computer, stored network share, or transmitted to other users and computers. Finally, additional security steps would be updates. Never install updates and patches on a production server until they've been tested on a test or development server. Malware. Although viruses don't pose much of a threat to the Linux server, if you run Samba to share Windows files, make sure an antivirus scanner like ClamAV is installed so infected files don't spread throughout your system. Backup and recovery. Servers that house terabytes of information, corporate websites, or catalogs for directory services need to have a backup and recovery strategy in place. And passwords. As a systems administrator, you're required to set passwords for your server's root account and possibly other sensitive accounts in your organization. And that is my presentation of the best practices for operating systems, firewalls, and security against Linux. So thank you so much for listening.